Sometimes, as we're working with specific filters or specific features of the program, we encounter situations in which the workflow of the program does not allow us to easily control certain things as we are building. An example of this is the wiggle effect, or the wiggle expression. So I have this spaceship here that is going to take off. Nothing fantastic. It's just a couple of keyframes, and actually, it's going fairly slow now that I look at it. Let me bring that back up to 2 seconds and see if that helps it. It's still slow, but it will do for the purposes of what we're trying to showcase. So what I want to do is, with the force of the rocket, as the rocket is taking off, it has to be shaking somewhat. You have to have some kind of shaking added to it. So I can either go in and start creating a bunch of position keyframes and then try to figure out how they start fading away through time, so that basically the ship is wiggling as it goes up, and then it goes smooth. It gets to be smooth after it gets to a certain point, which can be difficult. I mean, it's doable, but you're gonna end up with a lot of keyframes in there. You could do maybe a motion sketch and hope that it'll capture what you want, but point is that it's fairly difficult to produce. So what I want to do is, at this point, I want to add the wiggle expression, which we've used in the past. So I'm going to press the Alt key on the keyboard, keep it present, and press on stopwatch. And then I'm going to type wiggle, and then I'm going to give it an amplitude of, let's say, 30 pixels or 30 points on either side. And then I am going to add a frequency of about every 10 times per second. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on that, click off on that, and put a semicolon at the end of that. Now let's take a look at this, and you'll see that basically the ship is wiggling as it makes its way up. Okay, I have added also motion blur to it so that it looks smooth. And the ship wiggles at the beginning, as it should, but it keeps on wiggling as it goes up. Now, if I have no way of keyframing this because it's an expression. However, one of the utilities that we have available to us in After Effects is called sliders. Now, slide controls are just that. They're just sliders. It's just a slider, or it's basically a place where you can actually keyframe numbers and values. And those values are passed on to whatever you point them to. So how does this work? Well, let me go ahead and create a null object. So I'm going to create a null object, and I'm going to give it the name controller. And to that null object, I will be adding a filter called slide control. Slide control is something that you can find through filtering under effects and presets. You can go ahead and start typing slider control. And the slider control is basically this. It's nothing. It literally is just a number, and it allows you to enter any value you want. You can actually uncollapse that to see a line that allows you to go up to 100 visually here, but you could actually enter any value here. You could enter the value of whatever value you want in there. And so what happens now is that this slider control, I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it amplitude control, because this is going to control the amplitude of my rocket. So how do I make that slider a controller for that amplitude, which is this value here? Well, the way it works with expressions is, you'll notice that as we create the expressions, there's a set of tools that becomes available to us here, including that which I showed you when we talked about expressions, about giving you the ability to create expressions that are specific to, from the drop-up menu here. You also have a pick whip. And so that pick whip allows you to select a value within your expression. In this case, I'm going to select the amplitude part of the expression, the 30 in this case, and I'm going to use the pick whip to point to that slider. Now, what happens is, when I point to that slider, my expression changes to something. And basically, what it's telling, the expression changes to say that my controller, that value, the amplitude is now this. That's what it says. Basically, it's saying whatever that value was is now this. And so what happens now is that value is 0. So if you notice, there's no wiggle on my rocket as it takes off. However, this is keyframeable. So I can go ahead and set up at the very beginning of my timeline a value of 30, or let's say 50, and set a keyframe for it. Then at about 1 second's worth of time, or around here, let's say, I want the rocket by now to be steady. So I want that to be 0 at that point. And notice that I have basically the rocket shaking, and eventually it just goes steady. Now, I can exaggerate that or, control it even further if I open up the keyframes on the layer here on the timeline. Let me select the controller layer, press U on the keyboard, and perhaps I want to easy into this. So I want to go ahead and press F9 on that, or Shift F9. And maybe I even want to go further by using my graphing editor. Let's see, let me select this keyframe here and maybe exaggerate that even further. So let's see what effect that has on my rocket motion. So as you can see, I can now control this even further through changing the interpolation between those keyframes. Now, the key thing here is that this is now controlled, that portion is now controlled by the expression, and the expression is connected to the slider, meaning that I have now control over how that rocket is going to react. Let me actually extend this a little bit more so we see more of the rocket shaking and then going steady so you guys can see exactly what's happening. So that's one example of how this works. Basically, sliders work for that, but they work for anything, meaning you can apply them to anything, any value within any expression, and control that value through time, through keyframes from the controller. For example, let me create a new composition here. And in this composition, I am going to create a new a shape layer, and I'm going to add a circle to it. And this circle is going to have a fill as well. And I'm going to group these two things. I'm going to call it main, which is my main circle. Then I'm going to create 2 copies of this. The top one is going to be a matte. And the second one is going to be the content, the fill. So that's going to be, I'm going to call that circle. Okay. These 2 guys, I am going to, the circle and the matte, I am going to group. And then I am going to apply a merge paths modifier to this, or component. So I'm going to go ahead and say merge paths to these 2. And basically that's going to say this is the fill, that's the matte, and what is the merge paths, how do you call it, the merge paths Boolean operation I want? Well, I want where they intersect. And so I'm going to change the fill color for this from red to yellow so we can actually see what that is doing. And then I am going to change the position of the circle, not the matte, but the circle. I'm going to change its position from 0, 0 to 50, 50. You notice that basically the matte is this circle here. That's my matte. This right here is my matte. That's the matte. The circle is this here. And then we see the background because I have my main on. So if I turn off my main, basically that's the circle that's back there. So that's separate from the grouping that I'm working with. Okay, so that's basically what that is going to do. Now, let me go ahead and make copies of this guy. I'm going to go ahead and say this group 1. I'm going to change the name from group 1 to yellow. And I'm going to make a copy of that, 4 copies. So I'm going to put 4 in each quadrant. So I'm going to go to this one, open up its settings. I am going to go first and foremost to the fill. I want to change the fill color from that to green. And let me then collapse the fill. And then I'm going to go into the circle for that yellow 2 to its transformation value. And I'm going to go to, let's say, -50, 50. So now I have that copy moved to this side. Collapse that. Collapse yellow 2. And I'm going to rename it green. Oops. Green. Okay. Then I am going to the next one, yellow 3, and I'm going to change its color. First thing I'm going to do is change it to, let's say, the deep blue. Let's do that. And I am going to collapse the fill, the fill color. Then I'm going to go to the circle portion of that, transform its value from 50, 50 to -50, -50. So that I set it in this corner here. So I just move the circle, but remember, its matte remains in the center. There is the matte. So let me collapse that circle, and I'm going to rename that yellow 3 as blue. And then for the yellow 4, I am going to go to its fill color first and foremost, and I'm going to change it to this pinkish fuchsia thing. I'm going to change it to fill the circle for that. I'm going to change the transformation value from 50-50 to 50-50, so that it occupies that quadrant. And there it is. So now I have basically my basic setup. Let me call this pink. And now what I want to do is I want to control all of these things in order to do rotations and transformations and whatnot. So in order to do that, I want to create an null object. So if I create a null object and I call a controller, let's say, then I want to apply several slide controllers to that. The first slider controller is going to control the size of my overall circle. So circle size. Okay. Or yeah, let's actually call it mat size, because that makes more sense. And you'll see why in just a second. Mat size. Then I want to create I want to make a copy of that effect. I'm going to call it rotation. So I'm going to call that content rotation. Okay, and content would be each one of those color circles. And then maybe I want to make another copy of this, and I want to call it content size. So I want to control the sizes. So you'll note, you see where this is going. Basically, if I go ahead and now let's just, for example, I start filtering through the contents of this thing, I can go ahead and say, okay, let me actually lock this so I can see it all the time. So I want to lock it so that it doesn't matter where I click on, this is going to stay on. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and start filtering through the properties of this copies of that shape layer. So what I want to do is I want to start going for, first and foremost, the mat size. So I want to call this, I want to start with size. So when I do size, you notice this is why I call things mat and fill, or mat and circle and so on. So now I know that each one of these mat sizes, I filtered this out so that I only saw the size of the mats or anything that's its size. Basically, the combination mat size is what I want to apply to the mat size slider here. So if I go ahead and press the Alt key on my keyboard, or if I just go ahead and drag from the size pick whip to the slider for the mat size, you'll notice that it creates an actual expression for me there. And what I want to do is now with that expression set up, I want to go ahead and right click on that, on the size label, copy expressions only, and then I'm going to start scrolling down to look for the mat sizes for the other circles. So in this case, this one, control click on this one, slide down, control click on this one. And actually I want to apply that to the main as well. So I want to apply that size to this guy here. So what I want to do is with that done, I'm going to press Control V on my keyboard, and the expression from the first one was applied to all of those different properties of those circles. Now, all the sizes for those paths for the math circles has been controlled. It's controlled from this slider, mat size. Now, because this is 0, they disappear. But as I increase them, you'll notice that they all increase in size. So I know that my circle is 100 in size, because that's the standard size of a circle when you create it on the timeline. And so now I know that I have control over those mats. That's one. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the content size, which is the size that is for each one of the circles, one of each of the 4 copies that we made. So I'm going to go ahead and look for the size for the first one, which is circle size. There it is. I'm going to drag that one to content size. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. Right click on that. Once I've applied the expression to that size, I'm going to right click it, copy expression only. And then I want to go ahead and look for the paths for the ellipses for each one of the circles. So there it is. So that's the first one I encounter. Then there's that one. I am pressing Control, by the way, as I am selecting these. There's the other circle. Boom. So I only have 3 more copies because the first one was already done. So that's with those 3 copied, with those 3 sizes selected, I'm going to go ahead and paste the copied expression from the previous one. And you notice because this is 0, they all disappear. But when I make them 100, boom, now I have access to those. And so I can go ahead and control the size of the circles inside the mats. Then say, for example, I want to rotate all this stuff. So if I want to rotate, whoops, let me go ahead and select this again. And I want to change the rotation value. Rotation. So let's say I want to rotate the position of each one of the circles, or of the main thing, of the main object in the composition, the main circle. Well, when I filtered out by using the filter here, basically it's opened up the rotation transformation values for everything, from the circle over here, internal, to the mat, to the actual rotation value for the object. So you can actually rotate the whole thing from there. So if I want to rotate everything, if I want to rotate the content for each one of them, like so, I can go ahead and select the rotation for the entire object, pink in this case, not the circle, the mat, but the pink, and point it to the content rotation slider. Same deal as before, right click, copy expression, and then look for the transformation blue rotation. Select that one, then scroll down, green rotation control, click on rotation to select it, and then yellow rotation, control select that one. And even this one, if you want to click on that one, that's the main rotation, that's the red one in the back. And then when I paste the value, basically now this content rotation controls the way that whole thing rotates in there, including the main object outside, the red object, the red background. So I have control over all of these elements independently now. So now I can go ahead and start laying down keyframes if that's what I want to do. So for example, let me actually do actually for the rotation for the main, I'm probably going to change the rotation for the main. But for now, let's go ahead and work with this, see what this gives us. So let me actually do that. I'm going to create a new rotation, a new slider here, and I'm going to call that rotation main rotation. And I'm going to apply the rotation just to the red one, the main one, this one right here. So I'm going to call its rotation values, which I had here. Let me disconnect this from the code that it has already in it, from the expression, by pressing the Alt key, keeping it pressing, clicking on the stopwatch. You'll notice that it removes the red numbers, meaning it's been removed. And I want to apply that one to this slider here. So now I have a separate slider for that particular, for that circle only in the background, the main rotation basically. And so now what I want to do is, with all this setup, I want to create, let's say, I want to add another component to that layer. I want to add a repeater. So if I want to add a repeater in this direction, let's go ahead and repeat, say 7. So let's say if I make this, let's say 15, then I can go ahead and offset by -7, and that should cover the entire screen horizontally. Let me make a copy of the repeater. For vertical purposes, let's go to its transformation value for the new repeater, and notice that the position is 100, 0, so I want to make that 0, 100, so I can make 100 on the Y. Now I have repeaters for this going both vertically and horizontally. The beautiful thing about this now is that I control all of those objects from these sliders. So if I go ahead and say, for example, the content rotation, I can go ahead and rotate all of those things from here. I can go ahead and create keyframes for scaling. So let's actually do a couple of keyframes on this. So let me open up the controller keyframes. I mean the values for keyframes from this, and I am going to start with the values as they are. So I'm going to set keyframes for each one of them, and I'm going to open them up on the timeline so I can start working. That's the value that I want. Let's add 1 second. So I'm going to drag all of those to 1 second, to the 1 second mark. And I want to go ahead and work with say the scaling value. Which one is my scaling value here? The mat size. So I want to work with the mat size. I want to make it 0. So basically they'll go like that. And I also want to change the slider for the content size. So content size will also be 0 at this point, the beginning. So now I have both mat and content increasing in size. I want to offset them a little bit. So you see the mat growing and then the content growing. I want to also ease all this up. So I'm going to select keyframes and I'm going to press F9 so that everything has easy ease on it. So there it is. And let's say at this point, I want to start the rotation value. So let's move these rotation keyframes here. What happens when I rotate the main rotation? Let's take a look. So that's the main rotation. What happens when I rotate the main rotation by itself? Not much. But if I go ahead and select that shape up in its rotation and say I want to add that to that slider, now I can rotate the entire thing from here. So let's say that's what I want to do. I want to rotate this value from here to, say, to 215. And then I want to give it a value of 90. And F9 of that so that I can go ahead and create some kind of smoothing on it. But at the same time, I want to rotate the internal content in reverse. What does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and say I want that to be the rotation for content is 0 at this point. Then at this point, it would be -90. And so you'll notice that basically my content stays put in the circles, rotating, counter-rotating my rotation for the overall background. Let me F9 that as well. And so you have a fairly complex animation, fairly quickly put together by using expressions. And the expressions are literally just all controlled by, or created and controlled by simply pointing whatever value you're changing to a slider. So this slider controls allow you to connect these values even to the level of one specific component or one specific variable within your expressions, so that you can control that little one bit of information within your within your expression to make your composition come alive with full control. So as you saw with this, in this case, we drag full properties to be controlled by a slider, or in the previous one, we actually dug in all the way to one of the values only within my expression to control it from inside the actual slider control. So this is the way you use slider controls to affect the way expressions appear within your compositions.